Happy Monday to you, AP Government. We are continuing in the judicial branch. On Friday, we talked a little bit about the different levels of courts. We talked about district courts, federal appellate courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court, the court of last resort. The Supreme Court is where we're going to spend a lot of our time, both today and tomorrow, as we finish up the judicial branch. So what I want to start with today is looking at the different types of opinions that the court can deliver. So these terms can be used on your AP exam, and so I want to make sure that you understand what they mean. So, of course, if all 9 justices on the Supreme Court agree with a decision, that's called a unanimous opinion. So unanimous just means it's a 9-0 opinion. All 9 justices have agreed, and that's the strongest type of majority opinion you can give. A unanimous opinion and a majority opinion have the same level of legal weight. It's not like you get any bonus points for having a unanimous opinion, but it feels like it gives it more legitimacy. Right now on the court, there are some pretty conservative justices and there are some pretty liberal justices. And if we can have a case where they agree, then it gives a sense of legitimacy to the whole process. So Brown versus Board of Education, for example, in 1954 was a unanimous decision. All 9 justices agreed. There are some reports that the Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren, did a little bit of arm twisting to get a unanimous opinion. He really pushed to have all 9 justices agree, but that's okay. That happens behind closed doors as the justices search for a majority and try to come up with their opinion. A majority of opinion, look, we've got 9 justices. You can do the math. A majority requires 5 of them. So at least 5 justices to make a ruling. That's the magic number in order for the court to actually deliver a decision that's going to have any legal power. If you can't get to 5, then you don't have a majority. So you need 5 justices to agree in order to deliver an opinion. So of course, that can be a 5-4, can be a 6-3, and so on. So right now, there are 6 pretty conservative justices. So we have a pretty conservative court. They have a little bit of wiggle room as far as getting a majority of 5. They can afford to lose 1 and still have a majority. The confusing one, the one that trips up some students, is what's called a concurring opinion. A concurring opinion is something that one of the justices writes if they agree in part with the majority. So they are part of the majority. They are signed on with those at least 4 other justices to make a majority of at least 5. But if you write a concurring opinion, you have separate reasoning from the majority. So with the majority opinion, one of the justices will write out the whole majority opinion. If the Chief Justice is in the majority, it is their responsibility to write it or pass it off, delegate it to someone else. If you have a concurring opinion, you sign on to the majority, but you write a separate opinion where you outline your reasoning. So a concurring opinion can happen if you agree with the majority's decision, but you got there through different logic. So you're like, okay, the majority thinks that this should be the end result for one reason. I have a different reason, but I still got to the same end. You could write a concurring opinion. You're still signing on to the majority. It's still the same legal decision. You just have a different reasoning. That concurring opinion doesn't have legal teeth behind it, but it's just your way of expressing, hey, actually, here's how I got to this final decision. Or you can write a concurring opinion if you think the majority didn't go far enough. This happens frequently if there is a law and the Supreme Court is considering whether or not the law is constitutional. Right? They're exercising their power of judicial review, thanks to Marbury versus Madison. it's possible for the majority to rule part of the law unconstitutional, but keep the rest. They can declare just part of the law unconstitutional, and then they can keep the rest. So it's common for that to happen and for there to be a concurring opinion where a justice says, hey, I agree with the majority that that part of the law is unconstitutional. I actually think the whole thing is unconstitutional, but I couldn't create a majority that would agree with me. So I'm at least going to sign off on this opinion to rule part of it unconstitutional. So that is a common occurrence with concurring opinions. And then you write a dissenting opinion if you are in the minority. So if you're in the 4 on a 5-4 decision, or you're in the 3 on a 6-3 decision, you can write a dissenting opinion and you can say, I disagree with the majority, and here's my legal reasoning why. There is no legal power behind a dissenting opinion, but frequently dissenting opinions are used by lawyers in future arguments to try to overturn a decision. So a lawyer might come back in the future and say, hey, I know you've dealt with this issue before, but we're arguing on the basis of this dissenting opinion from when you dealt with it before, and we're trying to get you to agree. And you have to have a majority. That means you've got to have at least 5 to get that majority. Let's say there's only 8 justices. Let's say a justice has died or retired and we only have 8, or one of the justices has to recuse themselves, meaning they don't sit for the case, and we end up with a 4-4 split. If that happens, whatever the Court of Appeals ruled is left standing, but it does not set precedent. It applies only very narrowly in that specific instance. We've talked about this before with the Supreme Court. I just want to circle back and give you 2 examples of this. Think back to one of our foundational documents, Federalist 78. Federalist 78, Hamilton is responding to anti-Federalist arguments that this new, weird Supreme Court would become tyrannical, it's unelected, it's unaccountable to the people. And Hamilton said there's no way the courts can be tyrannical because they don't have their own enforcement power. And his direct quotation is here: no influence over either the sword or the purse. They have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. The Supreme Court can't enforce its own decisions. It relies on the other branches to treat it with legitimacy. And if they don't, if they refuse to enforce the court decisions, there's not a ton of recourse from the Supreme Court. I've given this example before, but this is a case while Andrew Jackson was president, Worcester v. Georgia. The Supreme Court ruled against the state of Georgia, said that they had to respect a treaty made with Native Americans, and the Jackson administration refused to enforce. This led to the Trail of Tears. Jackson simply refused to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. Contrast that with after Brown versus Board of Education, when you had Southern states engaged in a campaign of massive resistance against school integration. And you had the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, where the governor called out the National Guard and refused to let these students into school. So the president, Dwight Eisenhower, who was not a civil rights warrior, he was much more concerned with foreign policy issues, didn't want to get involved in civil rights, but he saw it as his constitutional obligation. The Supreme Court has ruled in Brown versus Board, the governor of Arkansas is acting in a way that contradicts the Constitution. Therefore, I, as the president, I have a responsibility to see to it that the Constitution is upheld and the law is enforced. So he nationalized the Arkansas National Guard and called them off, sent in the 101st Airborne to escort students to and from class. So that would be an example of the president using his power of enforcement to make sure that a Supreme Court decision, even one that he wasn't psyched about, to make sure that that decision got upheld. Okay, we're going to talk about 2 different ways of viewing The job of a Supreme Court justice, two different philosophies. One is called judicial restraint, and the other is called judicial activism. Judicial restraint is the idea that justices should not use the power of judicial review very much. If you exercise judicial restraint, you restrain yourself from declaring things unconstitutional. Typically, those who follow judicial restraint will say that they want to defer to the legislatures, let legislatures decide. They also view the Constitution through the lens of what's called originalism, that the Constitution should be viewed as the intent of the people who wrote the original document, that it should not be applied to new circumstances. So judicial restraint, less likely to use the power of judicial review and less likely to see the court as having a policy-making role. So I'll give you an example of judicial restraint. In 2015, there was a Supreme Court case that we'll talk about later in our civil rights chapter called Obergefell versus Hodges, which was the case that said no state can prevent same-sex marriage. They said any state law that prevents same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. There was a justice who dissented from that opinion, and basically his dissent said it doesn't really matter whether or not you believe that same-sex marriage is moral or immoral. That's not really for the courts to decide. His argument was that it should not be up to the courts, that it should be up to legislatures to make those decisions. And he sort of argued like, well, it's kind of already trending in this direction of states moving toward allowing same-sex marriage. So we should, if that's what voters want, then they'll vote in legislators who change the law. Whereas you have the other side, the more judicial activist side, who says, actually, it's the job of the courts to make sure that they uphold the Constitution. And if states are doing things unconstitutional, that's the whole point of judicial review, and the courts should step in. So judicial restraint is defer to the legislatures and let them make policy, and try not to make policy from the courts, right? Try not to get too involved in policymaking. So that would be summarized by this quotation from a current Supreme Court justice named Neil Gorsuch. It is the role of judges to apply, not alter, the work of the people's representatives. You get that sense of kind of deferring to the elected representatives of the people. Judicial activism is a term that gets thrown around a lot. It's typically applied more often to liberal justices, but it can describe both liberal and conservative justice. Basically, judicial activism is the idea that justices are making policy, not that they're applying the law, not that they're applying the Constitution, but that they're really legislating, they're making policy from the bench, and they're doing it based on their own conscience or based on public opinion. So judicial activism is kind of pejorative. It's kind of got a negative connotation. It is the sense that justices are have their own ideology, and whatever case is in front of them, they're going to try to fit their ideology into that case, regardless of the facts in front of them. So that is the accusation that comes with judicial activism. Those accused of judicial activism would be seen as being more likely to use judicial review to strike down laws that they ideologically disagree with. So it's very much centered around their own ideology or what they think public opinion is. All right, and then senatorial courtesy. So senatorial courtesy has to do with typically nominating federal judges who are not Supreme Court justices. Typically, this has to do with district and appellate judges. So remember, there's 3 levels of federal courts. You've got Supreme Court on the top, but the president also has to nominate judges for federal district court and federal courts of appeals. So that can be hundreds of openings within a presidency that the president has to fulfill. And let's say you're trying to fill a federal judge opening in Wyoming. If I'm president and there's a federal judge opening in Wyoming, I don't know anybody in Wyoming. So I got to figure out what I'm going to do about filling this federal judge's seat. So I'm going to go to the senator from Wyoming. I'm going to find one from my same party. And I'm going to say, hey, buddy, do you know anyone who would make a good federal district judge? And that person is going to point me in the direction of someone that they know who's qualified and also kind of shares our common ideology, who would be a good candidate. And I'll go ahead and nominate that person. I'll take your word for it. You know what? You're a good senator. We're from the same party. And again, I don't know anybody from your state. So sure, let's make that person a federal judge. So that is the concept of senatorial courtesy. The idea that a president defers to a senator to fill a judicial opening in that state. If you are nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, but the Senate rejects you, remember it's only a majority vote to get on the Supreme Court. So if the Senate holds a vote and then rejects you, the term for that is being borked. It is named after this handsome fellow up at the top here, Robert Bork, the guy who looks like a science fiction villain from the 80s. He really has that sense that he's about to explain his evil plan into the microphone. He was the Solicitor General under Richard Nixon, and he then served under Ronald Reagan as well. And Reagan nominated him for the Supreme Court. Senate Democrats mounted a very coordinated campaign against him. Senator Ted Kennedy gave this speech from the Senate floor about Bork's America and how it was going to be this dark dystopian future, and it worked. The Senate rejected Bork. He refused to withdraw his nomination, so there's an actual vote on him, and a majority voted against him. So now his name goes down in history as someone who has been rejected by the Senate. They got borked. And typically a nominee is interviewed first by the Senate Judiciary Committee. The committee will then recommend or not recommend that person for the job. And then the full Senate gets to debate and vote. That's the usual process. In 2016, in March of 2016, a Supreme Court justice named Antonin Scalia died. He was quite conservative, one of the most conservative justices on the court. And then President Barack Obama nominated a federal Court of Appeals judge named Merrick Garland to replace Scalia. Again, this is spring of 2016. The Senate was controlled by Republicans who did not want Obama to replace Scalia, so they simply did nothing. The Judiciary Committee never met with Garland. The Senate never voted on him. They just pretended that he did not exist until the 2016 election happened. Obviously, former President Trump won. And then shortly into 2017, shortly into his term, Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to fill that seat. And the Senate Republicans were like, oh, thank God, a nominee. We've been waiting so long. We wondered why this seat had been vacant for so long. So Neil Gorsuch became a Supreme Court justice. Merrick Garland went back to his job as a justice on the Court of Appeals. But Garland is now taking a new job. He was recently nominated and confirmed as the Attorney General, so for Joe Biden. So that will be his new gig. All right, so that's good for today. We will pick up with litigation tomorrow, and we'll talk about class action lawsuits and civil rights and all that stuff. So we'll pick up there on Tuesday, and then we'll probably do a Supreme Court type simulation on Wednesday, and then get into civil liberties and civil rights later in the week. So that's kind of where we are headed, and I am looking forward to it. So I will see you tomorrow.